Hello cinema lovers, welcome back to Rogue Cinema. Few horror franchises have had the kind of lasting impact that Insidious has had. What began in 2010 as a relatively simple haunted house story became one of the defining supernatural horror franchises of the modern era. And a major reason for that was James Wan. Alongside The Conjuring, Insidious helped establishing a new generation of mainstream horror built around atmosphere, jump scares, demons, and the idea that the real terror exists beyond what we can see. While The Conjuring eventually expanded into a much larger interconnected universe, Insidious remained more focused on its own mythology, particularly the further and the terrifying entities that inhabit it. Both franchises also demonstrated how commercially powerful modern supernatural horror could be. James Wan, in particular, became one of the most influential filmmakers in contemporary horror, helping shape a style that studio would repeatedly try to recreate. The success of these films also proved that the audience were still willing to embrace traditional supernatural horror on a major scale. Before proceeding further, we would appreciate your help and love by subscribing the channel and sharing this video with your friends and family. But more than a decade later, the horror landscape has changed. Audiences have changed, and the impact of these films have evolved. What once felt fresh and genuinely unsettling has gradually become familiar territory, with both franchises producing sequels, spin-offs, and increasingly recognizable horror formulas. And now, with Insidious 6, the question is no longer simply whether this franchise can scare us. The real question is, after all these years, does Insidious still have something terrifying left to say? Let's dive into the vital overview of Insidious Chapter 6. Direction. Jacob Chase attempts a bold stylistic detour by moving Insidious out of the further, away from the franchise's traditional jump scare mechanics, towards a slow-burning psychological drama. It gives the sixth installment a fresh identity, while allowing the film to explore its emotional core with greater maturity. Chase carefully established the emotional foundation, attempting to give fresh soul to a major horror franchise spanning nearly 15 years. His direction remains crisp and controlled, particularly in how he handles the written material without becoming overly indulgent. This restraint is especially welcome after the previous two installments struggled to maintain the franchise identity established by the early films. Out of the Further feels like a conscious attempt to rebuild that foundation rather than simply repeat a familiar formula. However, the stylistic shift doesn't overcome one key limitation: predictability. While Chase brings a different tonal approach, the thematic trajectory remains relatively easy to anticipate. The execution is controlled and thoughtful, but the destination is rarely surprising. Acting. Brandon Perea is convincing despite having barely 4 to 5 scenes, making the most of his limited screen time with a grounded performance. Joseph Lopez creates an immediate impact and looks genuinely terrifying, at least until he starts talking. His physical appearance, costume, and overall presence do most of the heavy lifting, creating an imposing screen image that the dialogue doesn't always sustain. Lin Shaye, despite her limited role, brings a sense of familiarity and comfort to the film. Her effortless presence helps keep Out of the Further connected to the franchise's established identity. Charlie Penton delivered an intense performance and is arguably the highlight of the film's opening stretch. She brings a rawness that immediately gives the story emotional weight. Amelia Eve delivers the strongest overall performance, balancing command and fragility with remarkable ease. She effectively anchors the supernatural dread in raw human vulnerability, giving the film an emotional center beyond its horror elements. Script, screenplay, and editing. Insidious Out of the Further has a fairly basic foundation from a storytelling perspective, essentially a haunted house narrative driven by emotional stakes. What makes it more interesting is the screenplay, which takes the familiar premise into a more psychologically layered territory. The film doesn't entirely depend on jump scares and frightening faces. Instead, it explores the further in a fresh and surprisingly effective manner. The childhood sequences are particularly strong, establishing an unsettling domestic atmosphere before the supernatural elements are fully understood. The writing is arguably the film's biggest strength. The Further is no longer merely a carnival funhouse of ghosts, but a dense, shadowy manifestation of repressed trauma. The mythology surrounding it is also extended thoughtfully, building upon the established idea of a mysterious realm existing between the worlds of the living and the dead. The introduction of travelers and couriers adds further structure to its supernatural rules and gives the mythology a more distinctive identity. The editing is equally composed, tightly knitted together the supernatural and emotional threads. The team clearly understand what audience expect from Insidious and structured the film accordingly, giving its different elements a systematic and cohesive flow. Dialogues. The dialogues are decent at best, but they serve their purpose effectively. To a considerable extent, the writing helps balancing the emotional core of the scenes without feeling excessively dramatic or forced. The conversations are fairly well written and contribute to the film's emotional foundation, even if they rarely stand out on their own. The dialogues work more as a supporting element, strengthening the character driven moments rather than attempting to become a highlight of the screenplay. Technical work, sound, and cinematography. The sound design and score may feel somewhere aged, but they remain effective in building tension. The film understands the value of restraint, allowing the atmosphere to tighten gradually until a jolt feels earned rather than mechanically manufactured. The production design is particularly impressive, perfectly capturing the franchise's damp, echoing atmosphere. Objects shifting at the corner of your eyes and corridors that seems to close in around the characters create an unsettling visual language. It is the atmospheric horror at its most effective, and easily among the film's strongest technical achievements. Impact. Insidious Out of the Further has already divided audiences, with social media reactions split between those appreciating its fresh approach and emotional core, and viewers frustrated by its predictable plot and tendency to play things safe within familiar franchise territory. Yet commercially, the franchise continues to demonstrate considerable strength. The film is currently targeting a 23 to 27 million domestic opening, with roughly $25 million as the midpoint of current projection. That kind of opening suggests that despite the mixed responses, Insidious remains a reliable theatrical horror brand with enough audience recognizing to sustain itself well into the sixth installment. Altogether, Insidious Out of the Further understands that horror becomes more effective when there is something meaningful at stake. Beneath the supernatural conflict lies a story about mother and daughter, fear and resilience, inherited trauma, and the determination to protect the next generation. It may not completely escape the predictability and familiarity that comes with the sixth installment, but its emotional grounding, controlled direction, and fresh exploration of the Further makes it a worthwhile addition to the franchise. Rather than relying solely on scares, the film attempts to make its horror resonate on more human level, and that remained its greatest strength. Overall, we give 69% to Insidious Out of the Further and congratulate Blumhouse for another strong commercial year, continuing to prove that its horror slate can consistently draw audience while keeping the genre relevant at the box office. Grace us with your views in comment section and please support us by liking this video. And if you haven't subscribed the channel yet, you're probably never going to see us again. And if you have or you're going to, then you're welcome to the Rogue Cinema family. See you soon.